Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. I'll shortly be joined by Professor Shireen Al-Adeimi to speak about the war in Yemen, the role of the US, Saudi Arabia, and even Canada in fueling this conflict. We'll also speak about the history which led up to this conflict and potential ways to put pressure to ensure that it is brought to an end.
The only reason Yemenis needed humanitarian aid is because they were blockaded and prevented from trading. It's because their water facilities were being bombed. It's because their hospitals were being bombed. It's because, heck, even their schools and their homes and cars were being bombed.
But first, please consider donating to the show by going to our website, theanalysis.news, and hitting the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Most importantly, get on our mailing list. That way you'll be emailed every time a new episode drops. You can also go to our YouTube channel, The Analysis-News, hit the subscribe button, and hit the bell. That way you'll get notifications, if you have your notifications enabled, every time a new show is published. See you in a bit. Joining me now to speak about the war in Yemen is Shireen Al-Adeimi. She's a professor of language and literacy at the Michigan State University and is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. So thank you so much for joining me, Shireen.
Thanks for having me, Tanya.
A few weeks ago on April 9th, we saw a positive image. We saw a handshake between the Houthi political leader al-Mashad and Saudi ambassador to Yemen, al-Jaber. So do you think we've reached a sort of breakthrough in this war right now?
I think certainly the peace talks have been very encouraging. Of course, we know that a ceasefire was reached back in April of 2022. And so for about a year or more than a year now, actually, there have not been Saudi-led airstrikes in Yemen. And that's a positive development. That's what we've been asking for. One of the things that we've been asking for so many years. And it represents just a change, at least in the war. The war is still ongoing, but it represents significant change in the war. So I think the handshake, the meeting is certainly positive. I think it surprised a lot of people because it represents a Saudi recognition of the de facto rule of the Houthis, for the Saudi representative to go right into the heart of Houthi control, which is in Sana'a, and to meet with them recognizes, I think, or shows that the Saudis finally understand who they're dealing with, and they're not dealing with just rebels as they've been calling them for the last several years, even though, of course, that's still, the title still fits in many ways, but they have organized themselves into a government over the last several years, and they have been the de facto rulers, and they control an area of Yemen where over 70% of the population, close to 80% of the population resides. And so I do think it's positive. There's still a long way to go before peace can be achieved. But I think anytime people are talking to one another instead of dropping bombs, that certainly is a development that we should be looking at positively.
But do you think this potential peace deal would have legs if it doesn't really incorporate some of the other political actors who have been involved in this conflict, actors besides the Saudis and the Houthis?
I think for a lasting peace, it absolutely has to include everybody. There is no getting rid of the Islah Party or members of the GPC party, which is the party of President Hadi or former President Hadi, or the Southern Transitional Council, which is the separatist group, or the Houthis. And so there is no getting rid of any of these elements, no matter what people or how people feel about them. So I do think that a lasting peace settlement needs to include all of these parties. Now, the other thing we have to realize, too, is that the Houthis have been fighting all of these factions alongside who are in the same camp as the Saudi-led coalition. So the STC is only powerful because they are backed by the United Arab Emirates. The Islah Party and President Hadi is not powerful, but members of his party and the Islah Party are only powerful because the Saudis have been funding them over the last several years, and they've been based in Riyadh for the most part. And so that, I think, we have to understand when, the Saudis are speaking to the Houthis directly, they're not just representing themselves. In a way, they're representing also these other groups that they have been training and backing and funding and hosting in their countries over the last several years. Now, after a Houthi-Saudi settlement is reached, and if these foreign entities stop funding these groups, and other groups, then I think there's hope for Yemenis to actually sit around the table with one another and discuss a settlement and reach an agreement that works for all of them. Because like I said, nobody's leaving the country. Nobody's just going to give up arms. Nobody's just going to give up their claims. And, Yemenis have to live with one another. They have to reach some kind of agreement among themselves.
And what do you think led to this particular moment right now where we're seeing, more dialogue, we're seeing different leaders and representatives meeting in Sana'a? What led to this particular moment?
So if you remember in early 2022, there had been strikes in Sana'a that, disabled Yemen's internet for 4 days. No country has ever done this to another country, just outright shut its communication to the rest of the world. And in that same week, there were attacks that killed 70 people at a detention center. So there was this escalation of attacks, and it followed, the UN not renewing this expert group, which was supposed to hold the Saudi-led coalition accountable for some of what they were doing in Yemen. So there were escalations on part of the Saudi-led coalition. At the same time, the Houthis escalated their strikes against both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And for the very first time in the last 8 years, they were able to successfully, I would say, target some areas. So there was an oil refinery in Jeddah that was hit. And there was also a facility in the UAE that was hit and was not, rebuffed by the UAE or Saudi in time. So I think everybody had a reason to talk to one another. The Houthis were not able to kind of wrest Ma'rib, which is a gas and oil rich province, out of the hands of the Saudis and their coalition. And at the same time, the Houthis, the Saudis were not able to move forward. Like there's been a stalemate for several years. And now they saw that the Houthis were actually going to be able to cause some economic disruptions in their countries. So I think everybody was incentivized to actually sit down and come up with an agreement that's negotiated and mediated by Oman, and come up with some kind of agreement that would work for all sides. And I mean, the Saudis, I think, have been exhausted by this. They have spent, by some accounts, $200 million a month on this war over the last several years. And to spend that kind of amount of money and to not see your goals achieved in any way, right? Like they weren't able to reinstate President Hadi to power. Eventually, they ended up setting him aside. They weren't able to recapture territories from the Houthis. What is it all for? And so I think there's a recognition that, well, there's all this pressure from the U.S., Congress not wanting to support the Saudi-led coalition anymore, and the Saudis are seeing that this was actually like a war that they could not win. The Emiratis, big question mark about their interests because they remain entangled in Yemen, and I don't think anybody's really focused on their role or focused as much on their role. But I think at the very least on the Saudi side, there's an interest to extract themselves from this war.
Yeah, the Emiratis are occupying an island just south of Yemen.
Right.
And I know that they have played a role in this conflict, but what has the role of China been, given the recent rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which was in large part negotiated by China, but also by Oman, and you also referenced Oman's role in these negotiations. But what has China's role been?
I think it would be interesting to see what their role could be. China did not sell weapons to the Saudis or the UAE. They didn't get involved in any way in the war. And I think Oman is one of those other countries, and uniquely Oman, because every other Gulf country and many other Arab countries and African countries joined the Saudi-led coalition in one way, shape, or the other. But Oman stayed neutral and has been hosting these talks for several years. This is not the first time they've hosted talks. China worked with Iran and Saudi Arabia directly and reached some kind of agreement to reinstate diplomatic relations and whatnot. I think that's a positive role. As for what they've done in Yemen, I would say, sure, any kind of peace talk or recognition of resumption of relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia is a positive move and does relieve some of those tensions. But, Iran's role in Yemen has been overstated over the last several years. So it doesn't directly affect the peace talks that have been happening between the Saudis and the Yemenis themselves. Although, of course, it does help that a major ally of the Houthis, Iran, is now, not in conflict with Saudi Arabia.
And do you think Iran's, I would say, economic isolation, as well as the backlash against Iran given the protests a few months ago, does this play into negotiations at all? Are the stakes higher for them to see peace in Yemen now more so than before?
I'm not sure what the Iranian intentions are. Again, I think that Iran's role has been overstated in Yemen. When the war began, this was just a few months after um, the Iran deal was negotiated with the Obama administration. So for Iran to risk the Iran deal, I think would have been foolish. There have been allegations by the U.S. that Iran has been involved. The Houthis have always said that they are not acting on behalf of Iran. There have been key moments where, for example, when the Houthis took over Sana'a in late 2014, the Iranians were very vocal about their stance against that takeover. And the Houthis were like, well, who are you to tell us what to do? And that was a pivotal moment. That is what kind of like set the spark that eventually led to this war in Yemen. And so, of course, they've been supporting them in some ways, but not to the extent that they would be considered a proxy war, or, not to the extent that they were supporting, let's say, the war in Syria. There are no Iranian generals on the ground. The country's under blockade, air, land, and sea blockade for the past several years. Journalists have to smuggle themselves in to report from inside of Yemen. People are starving to death because there's no medicine that's allowed to enter the country that has been approved by, or pharmaceutical companies have been trying to send, for example, or like aid that has been rotting in the ships because they're not allowed to enter the ports of Yemen, or fuel that has been rerouted to Jeddah. And yet we're somehow, these allegations that Iranians are somehow getting through all of these blockades and supporting the Houthis have just been preposterous. They're supporting them in other ways, just not in that way. Whatever support that they've shown for the Houthis has been minimal compared to the ways in which the international community has supported the Saudi-led coalition. And so I think Iran wouldn't want to risk. I think it looks good for Iran to show that they are interested in peace in Yemen, even though the conflict itself has very little to do with Iran. It's an internal conflict. It's a conflict between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And it is a culmination of, decades of intervention by Saudi Arabia in Yemen and decades of intervention by the United States in Yemen. So this is not an Iran Saudi conflict that's happening on the, at the borders in Yemen. This is a Yemeni-Saudi conflict that unfortunately is not even a war, has been just an asymmetrical attack on the country.
Well, before we speak about the humanitarian crisis in the country, you did touch on the history a bit. So maybe to give our viewers a bit more context, it would be good to speak about how this conflict came about. So in 2011, there was an uprising in Yemen which ousted Ali Abdullah Saleh, if I got that correct. And he was an authoritarian president, and he was forced to give power to his deputy, Hadi. So maybe you can explain what led to that and what people were protesting or uprising against, and how the Houthis came in to take power from there.
Yeah, so Arab Spring, early 2011, Yemenis were watching what was happening in Tunisia and then Egypt, and it seems like the protests were leading to positive change in these countries. And so I think for the first time, Yemenis, for the first time in a long time, not for the first time ever, because we have a history of uprisings and revolutions, but for the first time in a while, in like 3 decades, they found that maybe we could bring about change through these peaceful protests. And so in January of 2011, Yemenis started protesting. Now, they weren't necessarily protesting Ali Abdullah Saleh himself and only Ali Abdullah Saleh. They were protesting the entire system which Saleh used to keep himself in power and to enrich himself at the expense of the Yemeni people. Yemen is the poorest country in the Middle East, has been for many, many years, and is now among the poorest in the world. And yet Saleh was, by UN, estimates, one of the richest men in the world. And so, where is this man getting his resources from? Obviously, there was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of wealth that he and his party and the Islah Party, who he essentially created as a controlled opposition in the early 90s. This is like the Islamist party in Yemen. They were all part of that system that people were uprising against. Now, movement was peaceful until members of the Islah Party saw this as an opportunity for them to co-opt the revolution from the people. And even though they were part of that system and they were long-time Saleh allies, they became, they kind of took opposition. They went in opposition of Saleh himself and turned the conflict into a bloody mess. There was an assassination attempt. There was armed conflict. And when he survived that assassination attempt, that's when he agreed to transfer power to his vice president, Hadi. So Hadi was tasked with, again, nobody wanted Hadi. They say he was elected. If he's ran in a one-man election, that's not an election, that's an appointment, right? And it was supposed to be a 2-year term. It was extended by 1 more year. He resigned at some point and then unresigned. So he was just kind of flailing around over the next few years, not knowing how to bring all of these different factions together. Now, one of these factions was the Southern secessionists, who didn't even want to be part of the Union and they didn't want to be part of the Union since 1994, when there was a civil war between North and South. They eventually reorganized themselves into the current STC, which is, like I said, is funded and trained by the UAE. But, they had legitimate concerns that weren't addressed. The Houthis are a group from northern Yemen who initially started off in the late 90s as kind of vocal opposition to Saleh's corruption, Saleh's rule, but also Saleh's very close relationship to Saudi Arabia, which was becoming detrimental to Yemeni society. And what I mean by that is that, here enters the sectarian conversation. This is not a sectarian war, but the Houthis follow a version of Islam called Zaydi Islam, but they're not, a minority. 40% of Yemenis are Zaydi Muslims. And we don't have a history of fighting along sectarian lines. But what was happening in the late 90s and, early 2000s, actually early 90s as well, is that Saudi Arabia was exporting their version of Islam, Salafi Islam, Wahhabi Islam, to all of these other countries like Pakistan, like Afghanistan, like Yemen. I remember when the textbooks changed in school to, and they came printed from Saudi Arabia. Now, what that was doing, it was an attempt to erase Yemen's rich history of both Shafi'i Sunni Islam and Zaydi Shia Islam. And Houthis, they're a family of scholars, and they had a representative in parliament, and they were among the only people who were vocally, outwardly speaking out against this, even though many people within Yemeni society did not like these changes that were happening. And so that put them in opposition to Saleh, who, by the way, himself was a Zaydi. So this was not a sectarian issue, but he didn't handle critique very well. And so he fought 6 different wars against the Houthis and was not able to kind of get rid of them. And in some of these wars, he enlisted the Saudis for help because he made the argument that these people are at your border and, they're your problem as much as they're mine. So that's the history with the Houthis. So they became one of the groups then in post-2011 who were trying to have their voices heard. They come from a province that was severely underdeveloped. Like, we're talking no running water, electricity in many parts of the province. So, they had economic concerns as well, and all of these different groups had their own concerns. And Hadi was just not, bringing together people in any meaningful way. And that's what led to a lot of tensions, leading to 2014, when the Houthis just up and took over the capital, Sana'a, and in an attempt to force Hadi into doing something about it. But I don't know if I know I've spoken a lot, but I also want to highlight a key moment that happened between the Houthi takeover of Sana'a in late 2014 and the Saudi-led bombing in March 2015. During that time, there were still talks that were happening. And the UN envoy to Yemen at the time, Jamal bin Umar, talks about, when he writes about this in Newsweek, he writes about an agreement that was essentially reached between all of these different factions. He says it was, 10 painful weeks. And he says, but the agreement essentially reached, the different parties agreed about the legislative and the executive, kind of agreement that was supposed to work for people. And they were ready to sign the peace deal. And only 2 days later did Saudi Arabia start bombing. So that was the context. It wasn't all-out civil war. It was a lot of tension in the country. There was Houthi takeover. There was a lot of resentment. There were a lot of parties who were left unheard. but they were still able to negotiate something. Now, we don't know what would have happened with that, but they were able to negotiate a deal that was essentially derailed by Saudi Arabia intervening in 2015.
I have read about that, and I was wondering, what was it that actually made Saudi Arabia intervene in that moment, which you say was, 2 days after this potential peace deal had been negotiated? Did they already have U.S. support at that time, or did they maybe think that they would be militarily supported and they were overly confident that they could push through their own agenda?
I mean, they had U.S. support on day one. So the day they announced their war, which was, by the way, in English from D.C., not in Arabic from Riyadh, they made the announcement that they were leading this war in Yemen, called it Decisive Storm, and that announcement was made in D.C. And that very same day, the White House released a statement of support saying that they already created a joint planning cell, that they were supporting, that they're not at war, because that's illegal. So the Obama administration was very careful to say that they were not at war, but essentially everything they were doing signified that they were party to the war, that they might as well have been part of that coalition, because they were setting up, generals in the command room, supporting them with targets. They, of course, all of the weapons, most of the weapons that Saudi Arabia has comes from the U.S. And so from the very, very first day of the war, they knew that they had full support from the United States, and the United States was very vocal about that. Now, why did they intervene? They've intervened in Yemen in the past. They've intervened in the civil war in the 70s. They intervened when northern Yemenis were trying to oust the imamate, the father, son, grandson kind of monarchy that was taking shape, and turned Yemen into a republic. But Saudi Arabia supported the monarch for the next 8 years, even though he was a Zaidi. So religion here didn't matter. They just needed another monarch or another ally. So when the monarchy failed in Yemen and we turned into a republic, we're the only republic in that part of the region and part of that world. All of our neighbors are monarchies. And so they made sure that they had an ally in Yemen, a very close ally in Saleh. And when Saleh was gone, they knew that Hadi is a very close ally. Now, they knew that the Islah Party would be allies as well. They don't think they were too worried about the STC. But the one group they certainly did not want in that agreement, in that power sharing deal, is the Houthis, because they just spent the last several years fighting alongside Saleh to get rid of the Houthis, and being really embarrassed by the fact that they weren't able to control this group who has not, backed away from speaking outwardly against Saudi interventions in Yemen or Saudi interference in Yemen. So they didn't want the Houthis in power, and which is why they wanted to, what they said is intervene on the behalf of the, UN recognized legitimate president of Yemen, which years later they had no problem setting aside, literally woke him up in the middle of the night, said, hey, why don't you resign and transfer power to these 8 guys that we support? So that was the plan. Now, the miscalculation happened when they thought this was going to be a quick 2-week war, and they didn't realize that, when you attack people, they fight back. And that's the calculation that they did not make very well.
So what was the extent of the support of the Houthis in 2014? And what would you say characterizes their group? I'm sorry, Allah is also the other name of the Houthis. What characterizes them? Like, what is do they have a specific long-term goal or political ideology that you think sort of engenders broader support, or are they just filling in this sort of power vacuum, so to speak, and just fighting against the Saudi-led invasion, and that's what's perhaps giving them some more popularity?
I think it's a bit of both. When they took over the capital, Sana'a, there was still some small group from northern Yemen that, yes, they had been gaining a lot of sympathy from the general population, because, frankly, they were the only group that was able to stand up to Saleh and who seemed to not back down. Now, the southern secessionists, I lived in the south when the south declared secession from the north, and Saleh responded by bombing us for the next 3 months until all of the leaders in the south fled, and, the south was forced back into unity. And so southerners, secessionists, are looking at this saying, oh, wow, we weren't able to succeed when we spoke about Saleh. Your average Yemeni could not speak about Saleh without, getting disappeared or assassinated or something. Like, this was a country that was under political repression. And so the Houthis were seen as this group that was, that raised armed conflict in response to Saleh's, attack on them, because initially they were just speaking, and he attacked and they fought back. but they still weren't anything significant. They weren't a significant political party or anything like that. I think once they took over the capital in late 2014, people realized that they must have had support. Now, who did that support come from? It turns out it came from Saleh, which is very ironic here. They had been enemies for many years. But Saleh, even though he resigned, he wasn't like your average Arab Spring president. Like, he wasn't assassinated, he wasn't kicked out, he wasn't jailed. He, in fact, remained in Yemen. He negotiated a deal under the GCC that would prevent him from being persecuted for any crimes that people were accusing him of, and remained in control over large parts of the Yemeni army. So when the Houthis were able to very simply just kind of take over, march over from the north and take over with very little resistance, people felt like, well, is Saleh just telling the army not to act? And that's likely what happened, because when the Saudis started bombing in 2015, very quickly, Saleh and the Houthis joined forces, and he was able to mobilize parts of the Yemeni army that he still controlled, and they formed a unified kind of resistance to the intervention. It didn't last. It lasted for a good 2.5 years, but then at the end of 2017, Saleh decided to switch sides. He saw that this is not going anywhere, and he thought maybe this is his second coming, and he decided to switch sides, and within days, he was killed by the Houthis. So the Houthis then found themselves in Sana'a, now forced to rule. They did form a political group, an alliance with people from Saleh's party. And so initially, I don't think they had any ambitions to govern, but that's the role they found themselves in. And over the years, they've been, like, there is no security situation in northern Yemen where they rule. Now, if these were a very small group with no political power, every Yemeni is armed to the teeth, right? You would see a lot of resistance against the Houthis. We don't see a lot of that going on. In fact, we see the Houthis working with many northern tribes to gain their support and their trust. And so I think they've been able to do a kind of, alliance building kind of work over the last several years, and have been able to fold into their group many swaths of the Yemeni population who previously would not have been identifying with them at all. So they were seen as the people who stayed to defend the country. And that's why I think a lot of people support them in northern Yemen. So if the Saudis and the UAE and the Americans were worried about the support that the Houthis had, well, now they really have something to worry about, because now they have a lot of support from the population, whereas before they didn't.
Well, we can't speak about this conflict without addressing the United States' role in providing weapons to Saudi Arabia. And if I recall correctly, the U.S. even sent in Green Berets at some stage in the conflict, and they've sent over $50 billion worth of military funds, weapons and that sort of thing. Can you speak more about the role of U.S. as well as the War Powers Resolution of 2019, which was vetoed by the Trump administration and which was recently rediscussed? I think Bernie Sanders was a bit reluctant and said that he wanted to speak to the Biden administration once more before putting it to a vote.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so about almost $60 billion have been sent from the U.S. alone to Saudi and the UAE between fiscal years 2015 and 2021. So this doesn't count 2022. That adds up to about $22 million a day. And so we have that much in weapon sales just to those two countries. And then, of course, the Saudis and Emiratis purchase weapons from Canada, from Australia, from Germany, from Spain, from Italy, from all of these countries. Britain, of course, the UK. The other way that the U.S. supports the Saudi-led coalition and has throughout the years is through, like I said, the joint planning cells. So they actually have U.S. and UK commanders in the command room helping them with targeting. Up until late 2018, they were refueling Saudi jets mid-air. So they weren't only just training their pilots and helping them with maintenance and spare parts and weapons and all of that and helping them choose the targets, but these jets are flying mid-air over Yemeni airspace, and the U.S. was helping them refuel mid-air. That ended with the Trump administration in late 2018. So in every way, shape, or form, logistics, intelligence sharing, choosing targets, weapons, every single way that a war operates. The U.S. has had a hand in operating. So now that essentially amounted to a violation of the Constitution. There's a 1973 bill that was passed called the War Powers Act, and it became federal law in 1973 when journalists found out that the Nixon administration was secretly bombing Laos. And so they found out that, well, actually, we should not allow this to happen. We need to make sure that war making is something that only Congress can authorize and not a president. Now, of course, we know every president has violated that since 1973. Maybe not every president, but most presidents. But Congress never really stood up to any sitting president until 2019. And this was years of effort by activists in the making, where finally in 2019, a war power was passed in a bipartisan way, you could say, by both chambers of Congress, and it was largely seen by now by Democrats as Trump's war in Yemen. There was no recognition of Obama's role when we were trying during the Obama years to end this war and to hold the Obama administration accountable for what they were doing in Yemen. But it was easier for Democrats, at least, to see this as Trump's war, and they had the willingness to stand up against it. And Trump vetoed it, and we didn't have the 2/3 majority needed to undo the veto. So that fell apart. But that was an effort to end U.S. participation in the war. It wasn't going to end weapon sales because apparently those are separate transactions, but it was going to end all of these other logistical ways that the U.S. was supporting the Saudi-led coalition. Now, Biden's administration, here we go, 2021, and the very first policy speech that Biden gives, he makes a promise to end what he called offensive operations in Yemen. So this random dichotomy showed up in the vocabulary here, which it turns out that neither was, like, the Biden administration was not willing to define this for Congress, who was actively asking, hey, what does this mean? But not just that, but there's a government accountability report that came out last year that shows that the Biden administration itself didn't have a definition for what is offensive versus defensive. So it just said we're ending offensive participation in the war in Yemen, but continue to support the Saudis in the exact same ways that they've been supporting them throughout the last couple of administrations. And so we see here an unwillingness to break that alliance with Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia needs the U.S. and the U.S. needs Saudi Arabia. And no matter what somebody says to get elected, these are the commitments that they have to answer for. So Biden did assign a special envoy to Yemen, Lender King. And honestly, when I spoke to him, I met with him when he was here in Michigan meeting with Yemeni Americans. He sounded, and I told him this, I said, you sound like somebody who is a neutral, party to the war. You can't just go in and think that you're going to make peace with Houthis who are refusing to meet with you and the Saudis when you have been a partner with the Saudis throughout these years. So the Biden administration, I think, is not willing to see itself that way. And so we have a lot of, work to do still. It was really disheartening when, like you said, Bernie Sanders made another attempt at a war powers only to withdraw it because, frankly, the Biden administration threatened to veto. And so he knew that it would be vetoed and he felt like he needed more support. And we saw an unwillingness by many Democrats to now stand up to a Democratic president again. And many of them were saying, well, we trust Biden. He said he was going to end it. Let's just give him time. Meanwhile, the Saudi-led coalition was still getting a lot of support from the U.S. So, people just start wars on a whim, and then it takes all of these years and sometimes decades to end them. And unfortunately, that's what we're seeing in Yemen.
Right. Well, the U.S. continues to supply weapons to Saudi Arabia, but it seems like they have also obstructed negotiations in the past. I don't know if this was from the Pentagon leaks, but I think Tim Lender King, who you mentioned, the U.S. envoy to Yemen, refused some of the Houthis' demands, calling them maximalist, when Houthis were calling for public employees, civil employees, government employees to get paid because their salaries hadn't been paid out for years on end. And he seemed to just not think that this was worth negotiating and that it was a maximalist position. So how can the U.S. even be considered to be an arbiter or neutral in this conflict when they're still supplying weapons and actively obstructing some of the negotiations?
Exactly. So, and let's look at what he's calling a maximalist demand. So when the central bank was moved from Sana'a to Aden in 2016, they were using the central bank to pay government workers in the south, which again, south is 20% of the population, 80% of the population lives in the north. And those 80% government workers were not getting paid. So all of these years, they were not getting paid. And the Houthis, as one of the demands they made, is, again, this is not something that benefits the Houthis. This is something that benefits the average Yemeni. And they were asking for this average Yemeni to get paid. And they were wanting to use oil and gas revenues to pay government workers. So we have oil and gas revenues. They're being exported into other countries, and this money is being pocketed by the coalition or their representatives in the south. Certainly not the average Yemeni, because people are still starving to death, right? 80% of the population is still in need of humanitarian aid. And the Houthis eventually ended up in, late last year, when the presidential council essentially refused to use that money to pay for government workers. They ended up targeting those shipments. So they said, well, you can't then export Yemen's oil out. And that's one of the very few times we've seen Houthi attacks in South Yemen since the war began. They basically gave up on the South in mid-2015, July 2015. But in that instance, they said, well, if you're not going to use that money to pay government workers, then we're going to shut this operation down. And so the Saudis were actually willing to say, okay, fine, let's just use those revenues to pay for government workers. And here we go with Lender King saying these are maximalist demands, and he kept repeating that term as though like this is such an preposterous position. And we see, McGurk showing up in Saudi Arabia and Blinken talking to the Saudis, and you're just wondering and the Pentagon leaks, of course. And so you're wondering, like, why is the U.S. trying to derail this? And frankly, it's been big business for the United States, like I mentioned. And the other thing is that they don't want to seem like they've been sidelined. They were already sidelined by China when China negotiated this, return to diplomacy between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And now they might be sidelined again by Oman this time to actually negotiate a peace settlement in Yemen.
Well, you've spoken about how so many people have died in this conflict there are different estimates, but approximately 375,000 people have been killed in the war in Yemen over the past 8 years. Millions of people have been displaced internally, and some people have had to flee the country. And the media coverage of the war has been few and far between, and the coverage that we have seen, I feel at least, sort of misses the mark and doesn't really encapsulate the extent of the destruction and the gravity of this war. So I'd be interested to hear your view of the lack of media coverage on this war.
We have a free press in the U.S., and I have to remind myself that we have a free press in the U.S. And I say that because many mainstream sources have not behaved that way in the context of Yemen. They have operated almost like government spokespeople, to show a side of the conflict that the government approves of, to repeat Saudi lines and U.S. government lines very uncritically without really looking at the root of the conflict. And when they reported on this conflict, you often felt that this was some faraway thing that, it's just proxy war or a civil war, or all of these terms that were just thrown around with no critical, examination of them, and no accountability for how the U.S. has been driving this war. Literally, this war would not have continued for 8 years. Maybe it would have lasted a couple of months without U.S. support, but certainly not to this extent and not for this long without U.S. support. And yet we didn't hear the constant, like, why is the U.S. Nobody was asking Hillary Clinton when she was campaigning. And actually one person asked Hillary Clinton when she was campaigning about the role of the U.S. in Yemen. And she just looked at the reporter and just walked away, didn't even respond. Like, it didn't even feel the need to respond to this reporter. And so there was just no will to talk about Yemen. And many of us Yemenis have wondered over the years, what is it about Yemen? Are we poor? Yes, certainly we're poor. We have no representative on a global stage who would stand up to what's happening in Yemen. We don't have all of these countries talking about, like, oh, poor Yemenis are being attacked by Saudi Arabia. In fact, everybody was lining up to make money out of these defense contracts with Saudi Arabia and the UAE because they know that they have deep pockets, right? So unlike Ukrainians who were trying to flee the country and people were opening their doors to them, Yemenis found themselves shut in. That's why you have 4 million people internally displaced and very little mention of any refugee, Yemeni refugee crisis because people were literally trapped in, and countries that were previously giving visas to Yemenis were now no longer giving visas to them to even, start off in those countries. And only the very rich and the very well connected were really able to leave the country. And so, there was just the U.S. supported the Saudi-led coalition instead of holding them accountable. Now we hear, it's nauseating hearing what they talk about with Russia, not because it's wrong, but because it's just has not been applied to the U.S. in the same way, right? Yes, Russia should not be attacking its neighbors. Yes, Saudi Arabia should not be attacking its neighbors, and we shouldn't be jumping to the defense of Saudi Arabia and helping them. Oh, you need weapons? Oh, you need logistics? Oh, you need training? Or you need spare parts and maintenance? Sure, we're here to help, right? That was the U.S.'s position. And you would imagine that, especially post-Iraq war, when everybody was trying to be critical and self-reflective about how did we let this happen? How did we let our government essentially lie to us about waging this war? You felt that maybe they wouldn't do it again. And here we are. They did just that. And they let our government wage war. Now it looks different. There are no boots on the ground except Green Berets, like we mentioned earlier. But there was just a complete letdown, I think, of Yemenis and their rights to life and their rights to freedom, and a complete vilification of anything that was happening in Yemen, mischaracterization of the war as either civil war or proxy war, and certainly shutting down any humanitarian avenue. The only reason Yemenis needed humanitarian aid is because they were blockaded and prevented from trading. It's because their water facilities were being bombed. It's because their hospitals were being bombed. It's because, heck, even their schools and their homes and cars were being bombed. Not because there was some kind of drought, and not because, this was some kind of symmetrical war and they were inflicting similar harm to Saudi Arabia. We talk about Saudi and UAE citizens who have been killed in this war, and maybe you can count them on one hand compared to the millions of Yemeni lives that this war has either has certainly affected through either starvation or the hundreds of thousands who have been killed.
And it's kind of ironic that, so much humanitarian aid has gone to this, to helping Yemeni people, and yet there is a Saudi-led blockade on the country, and that's funded by the U.S. and by the UK and France and other countries. So it's almost like people are just throwing money at the problem, but the political will is really not there to resolve this issue because so much money is there to be made.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, and the humanitarian aid is a drop in the bucket compared to the need that this war has created. Like, when somebody doesn't know where their next meal is coming from, and those are millions of people in the country, even with all of this humanitarian aid, we see a child dying every 75 seconds. And so think about the gravity of the situation here. It wasn't called the world's worst humanitarian crisis for no reason, right? And yet, you see the UN thanking Saudi Arabia and UAE donors every time they needed to fill those pledges, or US donors. Why? These are the people who have created this crisis to begin with. This is nothing compared to what they're spending to destroy the country. And they're throwing crumbs at the Yemeni population as, this charity, right? And getting thanked on a public stage, even though they're the ones who have caused the Yemenis, by and large, to starve to death and to need this aid to begin with.
Yeah, they're not making it possible for Yemenis to leave the country either.
Right.
You could talk about Russia again and Ukraine and some of the double standards, and I think rightly so. Ukrainians have been accepted by neighboring European countries, but the destruction and the terrible conflict in Yemen should also necessitate a similar coordinated program, which would also intake people who are internally displaced, but also refugees who are fleeing the country and fleeing this war and poverty and devastation. And at least in the European context, that hasn't happened. I'm not quite sure about the U.S. context, but I would doubt that there is like a
it hasn't happened.
No,
it hasn't happened anywhere. It hasn't happened from Yemen's neighbors. It hasn't happened from all of these countries involved. Our airports were shut down and our ports were blockaded, and they were restricting movement within and outside the country. And so, like, none of this. It just showed that human lives are not equal. Like you would hope that human lives are equal, but they're not, because we see the response to the humanitarian crisis and the war in Ukraine, and we've seen the response over the last several years to what's happened in Yemen and, frankly, other countries as well, not just Yemenis, but I think Yemen represents the most egregious because of how widespread this conflict is. Within months of the war, I remember reading a quote from the head of the ICRC at the time, I believe, and he said, Yemen in 5 months looks like Syria in 5 years, right? That's how widespread the destruction was right away, right off the bat, in the first few months of the Obama administration getting involved in this. That's how widespread. Humanitarians were telling us that this is how widespread the destruction is across the country. And yet the international community decided to just let it happen, to try to throw money here and there at the crisis and not really think about, why is this happening? We need to stop this immediately. We cannot stand for our government supporting this war and making so much money out of the misery, from the misery of Yemenis.
One last question. You did speak about the press and how you were disappointed in the American press because I don't want to generalize, but the majority of the mainstream press has essentially served as corporate shills for defense contractors, for Biden administration, Trump administration. They haven't really held them to account and to put pressure on them for ending this war. So do you see certain potential positive changes coming about from the press shifting its role, or do you think civil society needs to put more pressure on the government for that to happen?
Yeah, I don't see the press all of a sudden changing. Some notable exceptions, I would say, are, Nama Al-Bagir is a CNN reporter who's of Sudanese origin, and she literally smuggled herself into northern Yemen and was the very first in mainstream press to talk about the blockade so openly, because they didn't want to call it a blockade. Even Lender King was denying the blockade even existed. Right now, we're seeing it feels like we've been gaslit the last several years. Yemeni Americans and Yemenis, we feel like we've been gaslit because, now as part of the agreement with the Saudis and the Houthis, the Saudis have lifted the blockade off of South Yemen. Oh, what is there to lift if there's no blockade, right? So they've apparently always acknowledged that there's a blockade, but they've spent all of this time, mincing words and saying, no, it's not. There's some restrictions, and we check for cargo and whatnot, and there's an arms embargo, but it's been a blockade since 2015, and we see it in that report from NAMA, this humanitarian crisis that was unfolding and the role of the United States in supporting this war. But that's far and few between examples that we talk about in mainstream sources. Now, non-mainstream forces have been all over this issue, and it's been great, and very critical. But I do think civil society, we have to care about this war. Just because there are no boots on the ground, it doesn't mean that the U.S. is not involved in a war. Why would Congress, in a bipartisan way, approve and vote for a measure that directs the president to end hostilities in Yemen if there are no hostilities in Yemen carried out by the United States? That makes no sense. We have these lawmakers who all agreed that, yes, actually the U.S. isn't illegally involved in Yemen. We should stop them. And yet the average person here in the U.S. doesn't really recognize Yemen as an ongoing war, right? And now I see there's even less of an incentive to do anything about it, because there's the sense, well, Yemenis and the Houthis and the Saudis are talking to one another, and so the war is going to end. Why should we bother with a war powers resolution? And I do think we should bother with a war powers resolution, because frankly, it doesn't matter what's happening on the ground. It matters what we allow our sitting president to do or not do. And that's the very least Congress can do, is to just reinstate its authority over this thing that the Constitution allows them or gives them the authority to do. Now, if the war, if the peace talks break down and Saudi Arabia begins bombing tomorrow, who knows? But we need to send a strong message that whatever happens, the U.S. is not going to be supporting them in this war in this way anymore. So I do think that pressure needs to remain here in civil society, and also in countries where, sure, maybe they're the UK is a big partner of this war, but countries like Canada, for example, have benefited from, the biggest arms deal was negotiated under the Harper government, but Trudeau's government saw it through, and they've always made the case that, well, we can't back from a deal, but all of these legal scholars are saying actually you can back away from a deal that is involved in killing innocent humans, right? Innocent people. And so we need to hold our own governments accountable for our own role. Yemenis, they don't want charity. They want accountability. We need reparations, and we need people to just let Yemenis be and let them resolve their own issues. None of this would have happened if Yemenis were allowed to actually enact the peace deal that they were more than capable of making in 2015, or more than capable of making in 2023.
Well, thanks for driving that message home. I think it's really important for people to know what's currently going on and how, various powers such as the US, Canada, Great Britain have been involved in this conflict and have pretended to not be involved and have had a very sort of hands-off approach or have actively derailed negotiations. This has been shown by some of the recent leaks. So I hope to have you on again, Shireen Al-Adeimi, to speak about Yemen. Hopefully there'll be some more positive developments in the very near future.
I hope so too. I hope we're not talking about war anymore when we talk.
I hope so. Maybe we could speak about Yemenis culture or something more positive.
Wouldn't that be great?
That would be great. Well, thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you're in a position to donate, please do go to the website, theAnalysis.news, and hit the donate button at the top right corner of the screen. Get on the mailing list so you don't miss any future episodes. And please also go to our YouTube channel, theAnalysis-news, hit the bell and the subscribe button. And see you next time.